So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for finding or making time in your day to be with us today. My name is Dave Westwood. I'm the current president of the Dalhousie Faculty Association, or DFA, as those who are from Dal will know us. And this is a speaker series panel discussion in honor of Pride. And this is put together on behalf of the DFA by our Communications Coordination Committee, who's chaired by Amy Birchall. Some folks here probably know Amy. I can see Owen, I think, is a colleague of Amy's up in Truro. And as well, thanks to Catherine Wall, who is communications officer with the DFA for her leadership in organizing the event behind the scenes. And thank you as well to our speakers, who I'll introduce momentarily. And at the start of every DFA event, we begin with a territorial acknowledgement. So I will turn now to that. So we begin today's event by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki, at least those of us who are in Nova Scotia, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Maliseet people signed with the British Crown from 1725 through 1761. The treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. Mi'kmaq treaty rights are constitutionally protected. Mi'kmaq people still live in Mi'kma'ki. So again, welcome to those of you who've just joined. Just so folks are aware, we are recording the event with the intention of making it available offline to folks who couldn't join today. We will stop the recording once we end the presentations and enter into a discussion period, so you can speak freely without fear of being or concern about being recorded. So the title of today's event is Bridging the Gap, How to Be an Ally and How to Build an Ally. And I think the panelists will speak to that sort of general theme in different ways. I know we've got three different perspectives from three folks who are kind enough to share with us today their time. So I'll introduce the speakers, and I will just say a housekeeping detail if you haven't already, if you don't mind just keeping your microphone muted. I think everybody's already doing that. So everybody's well versed with Teams etiquette by now, I assume, 5 or 10 years later, it feels like. Okay, so I'll introduce all the speakers, and then I'll tell you the order that they'll be presenting. So first of all, we have Dr. Susan Spronk, who's an associate professor in the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa, although Susan is currently in Montreal, as those who were here moments ago learned. She is co-chair of the Equity Committee of the CAUT, Canadian Association of University Teachers, for those who don't know that acronym. And she's currently serving as past president of the Association of Professors of the University of Ottawa, so the sort of a fellow association to DFA at University of Ottawa. Her academic work relates to equity and public services. So welcome, Susan. Thanks for being here. Good to see you again. We were in a meeting in Ottawa just a couple of days ago together, I think. The second speaker is, or well, not in order, but in the list here is Kyle Wilby, who is an associate professor and associate director of program evaluation at Dalhousie's College of Pharmacy, which is in Faculty of Health. A member of the 2 SLGBTQIA+ community, he conducts research to improve healthcare access for this community in the Maritimes. He has also led the development and implementation of a core 2 SLGBTQIA+ health curriculum for Dal Pharmacy students, and is working with pharmacy and health professional training programs across the world to do the same. Thank you and welcome, Kyle, for being here today. And the final speaker will be Owen Johnston, who is an instructor with Dalhousie's Veterinary Technology Program, which is in the Department of Animal Science and Aquaculture up on the Agriculture or Truro campus of Dalhousie. Before becoming an instructor, Owen was a student of that program and founded the award-winning Dal Out Truro Social Club for 2 SLGBTQIA+ students. Owen has volunteered with organizations such as the Nova Scotia Rainbow Action Project and with the Youth Project, catering to the needs of 2 SLGBTQIA+ youth 25 and under. So again, Owen, welcome and thank you for being here today. So that's probably enough from me. I think we'll turn the floor over to our speakers in the order that we arranged at the start of the meeting. Is we'll have Kyle present first, followed by Susan, and then Owen will be the third, and then we'll have lots of time, I hope, for discussion. and conversation afterwards. We have a hard cap, if I didn't say this already, at 3 o'clock. So folks, if you have places to be, you can rest assured we'll be done by 3 o'clock at the latest. Okay, so without further ado, I think we will get underway. Catherine, I'm just looking to you to see if I've forgotten anything I was meant to say. Thumbs up. Excellent. Okay, then. So Kyle, the virtual floor is yours.
Perfect. Thanks, David, and nice to see everybody here. I think we have the same cold, David, that I woke up with this morning. So if I sound a bit off, folks, please forgive me. I think something's going around these days. I'm just going to share my screen. And David, can you just confirm that everything's good? Perfect. Okay. So my presentation today is really going to focus on that component of how can we build an ally, which I really like how this presentation panel was put together, because I think this is something that we need to think a lot more of, especially those of us in educator roles, and really going to focus on the curriculum that we've implemented at the College of Pharmacy at Dalhousie, and give my lessons learned from that in terms of what went well, what have we learned that we needed to do better. Because I commonly get questions, and not just in the healthcare professions, but from people in all aspects of education and academia, of how do we actually implement programming into these programs, convince people that we need to do it, and then ultimately result in outcomes that our students are going to result in being allies and result in moving forward within their careers and contributing towards inclusion and belonging for 2S LGBTQ+ people. You might hear me default to 2S LGBTQ+. The acronym can be said in many different ways, but for me, usually when I'm giving presentations, that's the easiest way for me to move forward with that. So that's just where I'm going to head. So the first slide here is really how can we build that ally? And as I said, there's 4 key lessons that I want to talk about and give you a bit of an overview of what we've done within the College of Pharmacy, where we've implemented a core integrated curriculum across 4 years of study. And why I think this is novel is because usually we see this content as an elective course or a seminar that isn't assessed or something optional from an extracurricular activity within pharmacy, within the health professions, and within many different aspects of academia. And so actually having the support to put it right into our program and have all students take these concepts has been a really interesting and rewarding experience. And we've received some good feedback from our students that have actually finished that program now. These are the lessons I'm going to talk about, but we'll get right into that with the next slide. So this is an overview of our curriculum. Sometimes when people think pharmacy, they think of medications and they think of dispensaries and different pharmacies, community pharmacies throughout the communities that which you live. Pharmacy is very broader than that, especially in Nova Scotia. We have a very large scope of practice. We provide a lot of clinical services. We provide a lot of prescribing. If you had COVID vaccines, you might have even got one through your pharmacist. And so we do a lot of different services rather than just the provision of medications to patients. And so when I talk on this, especially outside of the pharmacy environment, it's important to really highlight that, because some of these concepts, especially communication, some of the other concepts in terms of advocacy, can relate if you're in an English program or if you're in an engineering program or other type of program. So our curriculum really took a broad lens. So we have content that's in therapeutics and sciences. So that means things like gender-affirming hormone therapy, where we teach our students how to identify, assess, and monitor patients taking those medications, as well as medications for pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV and other indications. We then also look at systemic discrimination and minority stress. So looking at a theoretical framework to really help students understand how system factors within our society can influence someone's experience within a pharmacy, but also within an education institution, within a library, within a sporting club, and really trying to understand how those factors can contribute to someone's sense of belonging and their experience with those different initiatives. Advocacy in practice, we teach our students hopefully to be allies, build them to be allies, so that when they're in practice and they see things that can be improved, that they're actually making those changes once they graduate and within their clinical rotations, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And even in the literature, so in the health sciences, we use literature to inform a lot of our decisions, and that's pretty, to date, it's been largely heteronormative, where based on populations that don't have some of the characteristics that we see within the 2S LGBTQ plus population. And so really having students take a second look at that and trying to understand how they can relate the literature that they're learning to their patients in practice. Similar if you're in a business school and you have clients identified as part of the community, I'm sure those concepts do transcend. And then, of course, here the core is communication. So students start really in their first year, and I see Lisa online, who leads this part of the program, looking at inclusive communication. How do we ask for pronouns? How can we do that effectively? And how can we use more neutral language within our interactions with patients, but also our colleagues, also our employees that are working within our pharmacies and other places. So again, quite broad, but has many different implications, not just to pharmacy, but across other professions. My lesson number one, when I get questions in this space is, well, how did you do this? How did you actually implement it in terms of putting it within the program and in terms of having it more year by year and integrated? And really it was to be strategic. I'm lucky that I had a lot of support at the College of Pharmacy when I arrived a couple of years ago in order to do this. And things were already happening within the College of Pharmacy as well. But some kind of basic things that we did was to align with accreditation standards, or maybe you don't have accreditation for your program, but there's more of your educational outcomes that you can link to, overall learning program objectives, where this content can be linked and really show that it's going to contribute, not just to people's experience with 2S LGBTQ plus people, but those concepts do resonate across different groups when we're thinking about equity and we're thinking about relationships as a whole. Searching for areas of integration to reduce time requirements. I present quite a bit around the world, and people always say, well, I don't have a week block to put this in. And I say, you don't need to do that. There's, if you're, for instance, with us, if there's a diabetes case about a patient, why can't we shift that case to, have that a 2S LGBTQ plus focus and talk about things like avoidance behaviors or delay of care. And there could be opportunities within, other schools' curriculum as well for integration if you're thinking about health equity, or if you're thinking about social factors such as racism, family status, relationships, of actually integrating the content and some of the learning points within those teaching events. Seek buy-in and support early. So again, that could be from people in your curriculum committee, that could be your students. I first started my career in this space in New Zealand about 4 years ago, and it was the students that actually advocated for this content and kind of drove me to start to work in this area. So they can be really strong advocates and allies within your respective programs to actually drive change, especially working with student societies and different groups in order to seek that support. And then have an evaluation strategy, because in my experience, anytime implementing something, it's always great to say, hey, we've got the evaluation strategy, we'll report back in a year and let you know how things have gone. This is just an example I wanted to show about being strategic. So these here are educational outcomes, or you could think of them as your overall program objectives. So if someone finishes a business program in marketing, what are they expected to do at the end? For pharmacy, we have these 7 different educational outcomes that we try to achieve. And one of the kind of strategic things we did with this curriculum was we mapped our own learning outcomes for the curriculum itself. I think we had about 13 of them. There's 2 examples here, or maybe there's only, I can't do mental math really quickly. I think it's around 12 to 13. We mapped it across all of these different educational outcomes. And why I find that important is because it shows that the learning points that we do when we're building allies, when we're talking about 2S LGBTQ plus initiatives within our curricula, it doesn't just relate to one of these as an example. Like advocate, a lot of people would think that would be the only place where there are 5, but we also have communication competencies, scholarly competencies, professional competencies, and others. And I think this was a really big learning point. And after I've provided some feedback to other programs, they've also had success with using this approach. Lesson number 2, and I don't like to rank these, but I think this one is one of the most important ones, is really to build capacity. Again, another common question I get is, we don't have an identifier as part of our program. How can we implement this? How can we do this without having that expertise? And it really is about understanding and working with your community organizations. I think some of the other speakers are going to talk about faculty associations and other aspects that can really be beneficial. For me, when I started, I was the only person that I knew of that was out in the college and working particularly in this space. And I had a lot of allies that came to me and wanted to take part or were already doing things. And that was great because we could capitalize on that energy and engage people in the different types of teaching events that they ended up having the confidence in order to actually instruct. And it wasn't solely put onto the identifiers as part of the program. An area here that I think is really important and something that we learned is we wanted to extend these conversations outside of just the classroom. So our students, they go from their coursework and they move into internships or clinical rotations, we call them, in the practice setting. So they go into pharmacies, they go into hospitals, and they start to do some patient care and work in those places before they graduate. And so it'd be similar to say if you had a co-op program or an internship program as part of your own programs as well. And we wanted those conversations to extend. We didn't want those students to go into those places and say, start to bring up, oh, hey, I think this, environment in your pharmacy might actually be contributing to systemic oppression, and, not having the preceptor or that pharmacist that's working in that environment really having those skills to, to manage and provide feedback to that student. And so with that, we've actually launched a whole training program for preceptors in the profession of pharmacy in order to help build capacity and build those allies, not just as students graduating, but throughout the pharmacy community as a whole. And I think that really has been a big learning point for us, where the more people that are exposed to these concepts, the more people that are exposed to LGBTQ health, LGBTQ plus issues, really does build that capacity and help to extend those conversations. Another learning point too, and this was quite interesting, is once we started to teach in this space, once we started to have more awareness from 2S LGBTQ plus health, we started to have many identifiers who might have been concealing as students come out. And so really working with your student support staff to ensure that, be wary that this might happen, and to provide the necessary skills and abilities to them to effectively manage those situations. I like to show this when I speak outside of the Maritimes. Of course, I think everyone here knows our geography, but our program is quite unique in Canada, where the pharmacy school at Dalhousie serves New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia. And so with that preceptor capacity building events that we did, we actually did a road show up to Moncton, Charlottetown, and then back to Halifax to try to, again, build as many allies as we could in practice, so that our students had the best opportunity to achieve their outcomes once they were working in those different settings. And as someone who's originally from Saskatchewan, it was wonderful to be able to go see many of these places. And with the actual capacity building, sometimes, and I had a really good conversation with Rick Ezekiel, the VP, yesterday about this, is sometimes when we host events such as EDI training, or sometimes when we label things according to 2S LGBTQ health or 2S LGBTQ issues as an example, is people that have an interest that come. And sometimes it's people that you don't know what you don't know. And sometimes people might not sign up for those events because they might not think it's relevant to them. And so one of the things that we did, which I think was really effective, is we really marketed these events about mentoring and providing feedback to students. And so we had a number of people come who probably wouldn't have come. I can't say that for sure, but I think they might not have come if we marketed it specifically as, improve yourself into us LGBTQ plus health. But when they came and they actually took our program, it was really interesting, the conversations they were having. Oh, I never knew this was an issue. Or, oh, I don't ask for pronouns regularly in my pharmacy. I need to do a better job of that. And so they started to really understand some of these issues, even though they were also learning it from a mentorship and feedback point of view. And so I think this little case example was one of the cases we use where, again, could be applicable in any setting, really, where someone was asking for, a student was referring to a patient as she, her, although the pronouns were they, them. And so we're asking our preceptors, how would they respond and mentor the student in this space. So again, just another learning point of how can we actually reach people who may not sign up or may not think that, that information session might be relevant to them. My lesson number 3, which I'll spend just a little bit of time on, is to not forget about the identifiers. When I was in New Zealand, I was just starting in this space. It was my 2nd year of doing it. And I had a research assistant who was a student working for me who identified as a lesbian. And I was like, hey, tomorrow we've got LGBTQ health coming. Are you excited? And she was like, no, I think I'm going to skip class. And I was like, what? I was like, why is that going to happen? And she thought, well, she was thinking that expectation of rejection, where her classmates might feel that she was the reason why they had to take that content, and felt that maybe they didn't want to take that content, and maybe there was going to be really heavy content where we're going to talk about health disparities in different parts of the population and community. And it really taught me that we have to really protect our identifiers in the classroom. As much as we want to build allies and be allies in the classroom, in our workplaces, with our colleagues, there's going to be identifiers present, whether they're out or concealed, and we need to be aware of that. And so I did publish a paper here. It's in a pharmacy education journal, but kind of goes over 8 different strategies that I've learned in my work, which I think are really useful. Some of the most important ones in terms of the actual content itself is co-creating content with communities. So bringing community identifiers, student organizations or faculty organizations in to actually help you develop that content to make sure it's relevant and not reinforcing stereotypes. One of the greatest things I did was actually have students peer review material that I did develop to seek their feedback so that I could understand how learning might occur. Explaining positionality. So if you are working in the space as an ally and you not identify, or for me, identify as a cis gay male, so I don't have experience as someone who's gender diverse, I explain that. I say, hey, this is what my perspective is. This is what I know. Of course, things might be different, and let's explore these different issues together and learn from each other. And so really just bringing that to the forefront and explaining your positionality of your own experiences, I find really helpful to kind of set that tone for that classroom session. One thing that I don't do is force engagement in these sessions. You never know when an identifier might be concealed or not want to speak up, is afraid of maybe outing themselves. And so I typically don't have forced engagement. I promote discussion, but I won't call on individual people. Instead, what I might do, though, is if I do know that there's some students that would be willing to talk, not necessarily identifiers, but even allies and non-identifiers, I might prompt them in advance with a few questions just to make sure that we are having a good discussion in that classroom and that people do feel safe and brave in order to take part. And then finally, just creating clear pathways to expertise is the other one I wanted to highlight. So if an instructor is keen and wants to teach inclusive language within their teaching sessions, as an example, and they're an ally, making sure that if questions do come up or discussion does arise, that there is a pathway back to somebody with expertise in order to support. So if there were questions in class that couldn't be dealt with, that there would be an avenue there in order to help that instructor out and to then provide that feedback back to the students. And finally, again, this is to evaluate, so formal, informal strategies and engaging all stakeholders. So really looking at faculty instructor experience, how we can best support them as they're working within the programs to achieve these objectives. Administrators, I talked about our preceptors at length, feedback from our students and also our student learning outcomes. And beyond the, did you like this type of event for students? I'm really keen on assessment. We do assess our students according to this content, and I think that's really important because students will take it seriously. And also it helps to drive, I think, their knowledge and their skills, not just around 2S LGBTQ+ health, but around equity as a whole forward. And we also seek feedback from community members to make sure that we are teaching the right concepts, we are driving things that we need to drive, and we can be dynamic in terms of the topics and content that we're creating in order to meet the needs. And one thing I've learned, of course, is to take pride in the feedback. It can be a really tough space to work in, especially at the start, and then it depends where you're at and what your department culture is like. But really thinking about things that the people, even the anecdotal points that people say. So the patient was really thankful for that I asked for pronouns. The pharmacy staff made changes based on my suggestions on their experiential rotation. Or I had a student say, I helped the patient find safe, non-pharmacological, so something that isn't a medication strategy for masculinization. So that's all quite good feedback that I think really supports the work, and hopefully that will translate into more other outcomes and more objective outcomes as we finish our evaluation plans. So I think that's it from me. I'll end my slideshow and stop sharing, which I think I've effectively done. But looking forward to any thoughts or questions and hearing from the other panelists as well.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Kyle. Very interesting and very important work that you're doing and continue to do. So thank you for sharing that with us. We will maybe hold discussion until the end so folks can listen to all the presentations, and then we'll come back as people would like. So next up, we have, as I mentioned, Dr. Susan Spronk, who's the current co-chair of CAUT's Equity Committee. And so, Susan, over to you. And thanks again for being here.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Susan Spronk. I'm joining you today from the Kanesake or Mohawk territory, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. That is Montreal. I'm a cisgendered woman. My pronouns are she and her. I'm mostly straight, and I work in solidarity with the LGBTQS community, and I'll explain what I mean by solidarity and its relationship to allyship in this conversation. Also, a shout out to all the prairie people. I was born on Treaty 6 territory in northern Alberta. So shout out to Kyle for being a prairie person too. And a lot of what I have to say actually overlaps really nicely with what Kyle just shared with us, especially lessons 3 and 4 in terms of co-creating content, carefully expressing negative feedback. And I want to talk about 3 things today. First, why equity, and particularly the role of academic staff associations, especially unions, in promoting equity through the practice of solidarity. I'm going to tell you a bit about our toolkit, although some of you might know about it because I was thrilled to see a link to the equity toolkit that's been created by the Canadian Association of University Teachers on your Dalhousie Faculty Association website, so that's great. And then I'll share a few ideas just before closing about what associations are doing and also what we can do to promote equity, and particularly talking about trans issues, which has really emerged to the fore of current struggles, given things happening in Canada, but also beyond in places like Florida. So let's talk a bit abstractly first. And I'm always asking myself this question about the why in terms of what we're doing. My background is in politics and political philosophy, so I'm always asking the why questions. So I do think the questions of equity are about eliminating systemic discrimination in the post-secondary environments. And these forms of discrimination appear in terms of barriers to access, employment, governance, inclusion, respect, acceptance. Also, particular forms of knowledge production, dissemination, and pedagogy that have been privileged over others, a practice that has limited the scope of scholarship, academic freedom, and excellence in the academy. So I do think that one of the roles that we play as academic staff associations is to create space in our post-secondary institutions, our universities, so that more diverse curricula can be enjoyed by our communities that reflect our communities' needs. Every academic discipline evolves through the challenge and incorporation of new ideas and evidence. And it's interesting to reflect on questions of equity because we encourage in our own practice and our disciplines on an openness to new ideas, new evidence, and new interpretation. And in fact, this is a core part of the academic process of generating and mobilizing knowledge. Our goal, I think, should be institutions that are free of systemic discrimination, the generation of new knowledge, and it would be based on the ideal of meritocracy, of the ideas that academia aspires to. I don't think we achieve yet, but we must recognize that this potential cannot be achieved when significant social groups are systematically excluded and disadvantaged in our profession, often in invisible ways. So systemic discrimination, institutional barriers, and exploitation are both visible and invisible on campus and play a role in an individual's academic achievements and career mobility. The myth of meritocracy promotes this idea that people have advanced based on their effort and abilities. But this leads often to a misunderstanding of equity work as an attempt to degrade the high standards of the academy. However, without full inclusion of all, we are unable to fill the ideal of a meritocratic academy or truly have academic freedom as a profession. So in our collective work, it's important not only to think about what we want to destroy, but what we want to build together. So in my work with COUT, I'm driven by a vision of post-secondary education in this country and an ecosystem of post-secondary education that serves Indigenous communities, Francophone communities, rural communities, queer communities, all over this country known as Canada. I also want to work in an institution where the composition of the academic staff reflects the populations that we serve, foremost our students. And anecdotal evidence does suggest that we have not achieved this goal. I think at Dalhousie you don't have data on equity. We can talk about that later, perhaps in the question and answer, but based upon hallway scans or website scans, we can see that our universities don't yet reflect the populations we serve across this country. So this vision, however, will not be achieved without active associations who are willing to defend our collective bargaining rights, along with core principles of shared governance and academic freedom, and also push for moving behind the principle of equity, which I do think our employers or central administrations have acknowledged, to talk more about the practice of equity. And this is about the difference between acknowledging through an anti-discrimination clause, which most of our collective agreements have, moving towards things that cost more money. And when we're asking for these things at the table, this is where we tend to get more resistance in our equity struggle. So one of the reasons that academic staff in Canada have amongst the best working conditions in the Anglophone world, and here I'm thinking of Australia, the United States, or the United Kingdom, is the strength of our academic staff associations, particularly our unions. You may not know that amongst Canadian universities, we have more than 90% density, meaning that almost all institutions in this country are certified unions, including Dalhousie Faculty Association, my association as well. It's only Toronto, McMaster, Waterloo, and McGill, although recently McGill law professors did certify a new bargaining unit, which is very exciting to see. And I do think that all of this work, in addition to the equity struggle, is about our working conditions are our students' learning conditions, which means that our struggles for working conditions are about access to quality education. So let me talk a little bit about solidarity and why I think unions are important here. Unions are built on the notion of solidarity, which is a related but distinct concept from allyship. Allyship tends to be focused on interpersonal interactions, and this is fundamental to our practice. One community working on behalf or alongside another. Solidarity work, on the other hand, is about actively and intentionally working to redistribute the unfair gains of systemic oppression. So it means recognizing the destructiveness of system forms of oppression, such as heterosexism, cisgenderism, homophobia, sexism, racism, and ableism to everyone and working towards collective well-being. Solidarity also means committing to do the work without relying on oppressed communities to provide education or affirmation. So equity is more than a particular set of issues. It is a lens through which all issues should be considered. It is not about balancing different competing interests. It is about achieving justice for all. One of my favorite sayings in the union movement is an injury to one, an injury to all. As we continue our equity work, however, it is important that we always be self-reflective on how we engage in this anti-oppression work. And so I'm going to talk about the toolkit, which is my point number 2, which we launched in 2021. And this is a toolkit that's designed to provide resources on how to practice solidarity. The toolkit is also a reflection of the change in the Canadian Association of University Teachers, which reflects the changes that we're seeing in our associations, which is an emphasis moving towards organizing members to gain power to get what we need at the table, rather than simply mobilizing members. I won't go into those differences, but it's this principle that what you want to win at the table is directly related to the amount of power that you have. Power in our organizations is not simply having good arguments, because we all have good arguments. It's about having the arguments or the demands at the table being socialized and supported by the members who are willing to go out on the line to defend these principles. So the toolkit is a reflection of the way that COUT is moving towards looking at the practice of equity. So for example, when I first joined COUT in 2017, I went to the equity conference, and it was an academic conference. It was like, had panels, it had speakers, including people from central administrations. I actually thought it was kind of weird. I'm like, I thought this was a union conference. But now when you go to COUT events, it's about bargaining for equity. What are these tools? How are the how tools? Really moving towards what are the things that we need in our associations to be able to do this solidarity work to advance questions of equity, including for the LGBTQ2S+ community. So I'm going to highlight a few for you here, and I don't have a PowerPoint, but I am going to try to use the chat. Give me a second. And I'm going to pop it in the chat. So for those of you who are at a computer, this is the first article I'm going to talk about. And this is about giving feedback respectfully. It connects directly to what Kyle was saying earlier. So one of the tools in the toolkit, for example, we have tools for change. We have tools for advancing things at the table, pay equity. But we also have little explainers on basic concepts in our movement, such as calling in versus calling out. So calling in, there's a wonderful link there to a video by Loretta Ross, the social justice campaigner, advocate, organizer from the United States, who talks about calling in is done with love, right? So when we're talking about our colleagues, our movements, it's about approaching that person respectfully. Usually one-on-one is best. In person can be best, depending on the format, rather than calling out someone you've invited them to a fight, rather to a conversation. So basic things like that. So our toolkit has explainers like this that help frame concepts that we need when we're doing this work. I'm also going to draw particular attention, because we are talking about LGBTQS plus rights, particular trans rights I'm going to talk about at the end. But we have a cluster on academic freedom. So if you go to the Take Action and you scroll to the bottom of this part of the toolkit, you will find a cluster about how academic freedom and equity need to be seen as principles that reinforce each other. Unlike other jurisdictions, meaning Australia, UK, US, academic freedom in Canada is a labor right that is protected mostly by our collective agreements, although there is some reference in the Supreme Court of Canada decisions to academic freedom. But it's also enshrined in every collective agreements in this country of an academic staff association. It includes 4 components: your freedom to teach, freedom to do research, intramural speech, meaning your ability to take on the administration and to criticize administration, and also extramural speech in terms of also being able to criticize the administration both within the walls and outside of the walls of the university. And these aspects of academic freedom are really fundamental, because sometimes in order to push equity struggles, we need to be able to point to areas where there's room for improvements in our associations. And of course, we're not where we would want to be in most cases. I know at the University of Ottawa, we are certainly not. So Canadian post-secondary institutions have much more work to do to become more diverse, accessible, tolerant, and inclusive. And universities and colleges must work to expand and diversify the professoriate and the student body. The value of academic freedom becomes more important than ever in this work. The academic freedom works to protect and advance diverse forms of teaching, research, and knowledge creation, and intramural and extramural speech. The tenets and practices of academic freedom have enabled the progress of diversity and equity on campuses in research and scholarship. For example, supporting the formation of gender, Indigenous, and critical race studies, often in the face of opposition from powerful vested interests. So I'm going to leave you with 2 things that I think we need to think about in terms of practicing solidarity with respect to LGBTQS plus issues. One, I'm going to share with you another, this is my last from the toolkit, and this is a link to a contribution by a colleague from Trent University Faculty Association. And we have a case study here on what the Trent University Faculty Association has been doing, very similar to what you could be in this toolkit too in terms of this event. And so Dr. Susan Hillcock has created a lovely list about what you can think about in terms of raising awareness of queer issues. And so she writes, review collective agreement to identify areas to bargain for greater representation and inclusion, declare academic staff association offices and meetings as welcoming spaces, have queer representation on the executive, have queer committees and/or caucuses, regularly review modes of operation to see what barriers exist that limit queer participation, support grievances to address issues and incidents of discrimination that occur on campus, collaboratively work with stakeholders, including other unions, student associations, human rights office, etc., to analyze institutional policies such as budgets, hiring, tenure, and promotion criteria, and the use of student evaluations to improve campus climates for queers, advocate for gender-neutral bathrooms, and organize campaigns and hold and support events to celebrate queer contributions and pride. And here we are today doing just that, so congratulations to your association for that. So I'll just leave you with some thoughts in terms of what we can be doing at the table to push these issues. And I'm going to address particularly trans rights, which, as I mentioned in the beginning, is really emerging as one of the new frontiers of struggle. And so I think there's 5 different ways that our collective agreements could touch on these issues, including rights of privacy and safety, updating employee records, such as removing dead names, facilities, which were just mentioned in terms of enshrining in the collective agreement rights to gender-neutral bathrooms. Healthcare coverage is, of course, a big issue. I'm not as familiar with Nova Scotia as I am with Ontario, and benefits. So I did a scan of the COUT database. So we have a database of the collective agreements in the country to help us inform what we're asking for at the table. And I looked up gender transition. And to my knowledge, there's only 3 associations in the country that have some kind of reference to gender transition. The University of Toronto Faculty Association has agreed to engage in discussions, and the Trent University Faculty Association and Toronto Metropolitan University Faculty Association, formerly known as Ryerson, have language on benefits, including funds to support health services not covered by the provincial health plan or as determined by the association. So at Trent, they have $5,000, and at Toronto Metropolitan, they have $10,000. And in the latter, it's actually administered by the association. So I'll leave you with those thoughts. I look forward to any questions you might have about collective bargaining, COUT, et cetera, what's going on at the University of Ottawa. But in closing, I do want to emphasize that the Equity Toolkit is a living resource, and it will grow and evolve with your inputs. If you have any questions, comments, case studies, questions, we want to hear from you. It's going to improve with the interaction with faculty associations such as yours, so it's really thrilled to be here. Thanks to the organizers for that. You can email me. I'll put my email in the chat, or you can also email education. It'll go to one of the staff of COUT. Thanks very much. I'll pass it over.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Susan. And thank you for popping the links in the chat. They did show up for me at least. And hopefully we can get those attached to the recording as well for other folks. I don't know quite how that works, but and thank you to all your leadership at CAUT. As I mentioned, Susan and I were both sort of different sessions from COUT last week. Susan was there co-chairing equity. I was there on collective bargaining and organizing, and we did have a joint committee meeting where we talked about some of the challenges and learning from other associations is so important. So thank you for sharing some of that with us, and hopefully we can chat a bit more after. So thank you. And next and final speaker for the panel, and last but not least, of course, is Owen Johnston. And so Owen, I'll just turn the floor to you, and thank you for being here today. Oh, I think you're still on mute, probably.
Great, already making a tech mistake. All right, I was muted. Great. All I want to say is that, yeah, I'm an instructor with the Veterinary Technology Program at Dalhousie. And I just want to say, like, I know I've been invited to talk about allyship, but I figured rather than focusing on a more like 101 style on how to be an ally in 15 minutes, I thought I'd actually share a few more anecdotal stories that kind of demonstrates more of the role and importance of allies and why we still need them. And I figured we could talk more about how to be an ally during the discussion period. I'm really happy to answer questions and get into further things, but I thought let's just talk about, like, why does it still matter? Why do these things still matter? And I wanted to approach this idea with a focus particularly on rural communities, as I find when we're often having discussions surrounding the queer community, we're often talking about it from a really urban-centric lens that focuses on places where the queer community is already established and has resources and supports. And so allyship can look very different in these scenarios. For example, queer students' experiences at Dalhousie University at the Halifax campus in the city be very different from their experiences at the agricultural campus in Truro. So I'm going to be talking a lot about Truro and less about Dalhousie, but I want you to see how these kind of perceptions could shape students that are considering going to this campus of this university. So I'm going to use my personal story to shed some light in that perspective, as well as just kind of historical knowledge. And I just wanted to note that I will be choosing to use the term queer when discussing the 2S LGBTQI+ community, but I do use this term cautiously, as I know not everyone's comfortable with the use of this reclaimed term. But when I do use it, I'm using kind of an umbrella term for people that are not straight or cisgendered. And I also want to make note that some of the topics I'll be discussing today could be distressing, but I think that this discomfort that you might feel would be important for just understanding how vitally needed allyship still is in 2023. So just a little bit first, so you understand where my talk is coming from. I do not come from an academic background in studying queerness, so I'm not going to pretend to talk at that kind of academic level. My background comes from queer grassroots activist organizing. I grew up closeted in a small town. I didn't dare to come out until after I graduated high school in 2005 and moved to the city, which was Halifax. And then since then, I've lived primarily as an urban queer, finding my way into activism around 2007. So I highlight this because I think that my background is important to understand my place in this story of rural queerness, where I've mostly been a city queer, as well as my place within allyship. And so what I mean by this is I want to share with you my story of re-entering a small town after being this, queer activist in this urban environment, where I found it so easy to engage with other queer folks and feel supported by allies, and I generally felt pretty safe to live openly. And I have to admit, I was actually scared to move away from the city and move to this small town to go to school. I think there's this kind of common conception within the queer community and almost acceptance of the idea that small towns are going to be more homophobic or transphobic compared to larger cities, which are generally more welcome to diversity. So for this reason, queer folks often tend to move away from small towns like I did when I graduated high school, opting to live only in big cities where they can live as their true selves. So flash forward to 2013, 8 years after I first came out, 6 years after being heavily involved in the queer organizing, where I make the decision to move away from the city to Truro to take the same veterinary technology program that I'm now teaching in. And so I wanted to let you know that I was actually scared to move to Truro, despite, being a kind of more privileged person where I feel really confident and accepted, in my own community in the city. And here I am going to a small town and I'm still scared. And I want you to know it's not just because Truro is a small town that I was scared. It's actually because Truro is a small town with a widely publicly known history of homophobia. And I think that's really important to touch on. So I want to walk through some of that history now, see why I was scared to move to Truro and why other queer students might still be scared, knowing this historical context. And this will kind of set the tone for the overarching story. So I've chosen to share a lot of the story via newspaper headlines and clippings to give that historical context that I'm talking about, as well as create a timeline showing why someone queer growing up in Nova Scotia reading this news might not want to live rurally in general, but also specifically not want to live in Truro. So in 2007, back when I had just become an activist, I heard about the mayor of Truro refusing to fly the Pride flag during Pride Week. Then 2 years later, I heard the mayor had increased his kind of homophobic actions by not only continuing to refuse to fly the flag, but now was actively trying to persecute gay men by shutting down a local pickup spot, something that he was thankfully unsuccessful in accomplishing. And then I just continued to hear other stories of homophobia, even as recently as 2011. So even just knowing that I was moving and deciding to move to Truro in 2013, I was kind of still scared. And unfortunately, my fears were not unfounded, which I figured out before I could even officially move to Truro. I want to share this really charming anonymous email I received when I posted an ad online looking for a queer-friendly roommate in Truro as a student. And I always read this quote with a really bad country drawl impression because at the time I thought Truro was like the deep country, which is totally not. But here's this quote from this email I received. "No one likes queers around here, boy, don't you know? Truro hates queers. Don't come around here." So this was my welcome to Truro before I'd even left my city. But despite this incident, while it did make me temporarily question whether I might need to go back in the closet, I did decide to take the risk and move to Truro and live there openly. So while this story is starting where I've started here, I actually want to go back in time before I moved to Truro. And actually, I want to focus on that first story I mentioned about the incident around this pride flag, as that's going to be of Truro, Bill Mills, and the town council had been approached with a request to fly the pride flag at City Hall, a pretty simple request. However, the council voted against it because the mayor couldn't support it, stating that flying the pride flag promotes a lifestyle that conflicts with his religious views, and sadly, most of the town actually backed his view and had voted at a 6-1 against it. Only in favor of raising the pride flag. One councillor said that she voted against raising the flag out of respect for their queer lifestyle choice, and that her queer friends who have chosen this lifestyle are actually humiliated and demoralized by rainbow flags and pride parades. I have no idea who her friends are, but that is a wild, wild quote that I just wanted to throw in there. But worse than that, the mayor was actually quoted conflating homosexuals with pedophiles, which is a really dangerous rhetoric that has been both used historically and has had a resurgence recently to fuel homophobia. And also went on to say, kind of ironically, he wondered, what else is the queer community still fighting for since we already have pension benefits, as if there was nothing else to fight for. And this was, again, we're thinking 2007. And I say this ironically because I think the story will highlight exactly why we're still fighting for many of the same things we've been fighting for since the beginning. And so it probably doesn't need to be pointed out here, but maybe with the exception of the one person that actually did vote in favor of raising the flag, there are no allies on this slide, but I promise you I'm going to get to that. The town council's decision appeared to be kind of puzzling. It presented weird views of how people of Truro might view queer people and their sense of belonging within Truro. And with this, there was actually quite a mixed community reaction too, as in a local paper, they ran a poll that had a 50-50 split and people either supporting or not supporting the decision about raising this flag. We had in one quote, we had lots of people sharing different reactions. We had the one councillor saying that the mayor was speaking for a large silent majority, saying that's what the townsfolk think because these are the elected officials. But some residents actually felt that the kind of decision had made the town seem less tolerant of homosexuality. Some were worrying about Truro's reputation, appearing as a very, very homophobic town, and that the flag's rejection would give Truro a bad name. Some residents expressed that the council made a really bad decision that ended up representing the town and feared that it would give a black eye to Truro to the rest of the world. But beyond the fear of the town's reputation, more importantly, the council's decision made queer folks that were living in Truro feel ostracized and unwelcome. And then I also just wanted to highlight quickly the words of the county mayor, Mike Smith, not to be confused with the town mayor, Bill Mills, who was the one that voted against the flag. Smith had thought that the decision made Truro look discriminatory and backward thinking. And despite having had these conversations for 15 to 20 years already, he believed that we were way past worrying about flying with pride flags or gay rights parades. So it was nice to hear one person saying these sort of things. And I found this last quote kind of really interesting because, as you're going to see, we really aren't past worrying about things like flying pride flags. And it's in thinking that we're past it that we forget to protect it or fight it to keep it. And I also want you to just remember Mike Smith's name as the county mayor, because I'm going to bring him up again in a second. So just remembering that he was someone that was in support. So following the rainbow flag decision, a local gay rights group within Truro filed a human rights complaint against the town. The complaint was based on both Canadian and provincial human rights legislation, which protects against discrimination based on sexual orientation. There's also a rally, and this was just, one day after, over 100 people came from the community to rally against this decision. And so that was not just queer people. That was actually just community members, allies within the community that were like, no, we are going to voicefully show this is not something that we support. So it's nice to see the town kind of fought back a bit. And then one thing that I thought was kind of interesting was that county mayor that I mentioned, Mike Smith, he was so appalled by the actions of the town mayor that he actually did fly the pride flag in Truro out of his county office, which just happened to be in Truro. So it was a very small victory, but it was very much aided by allies, and I thought that was important. And remembering this was 2007. I'd only graduated high school 2 years ago. So however, it was not until 9 years later, almost a decade later, that the pride flag was finally flown at City Hall. So, don't want to go that. I just want to say that it actually took, which is sad, a tragic mass shooting at the gay bar in Orlando, Florida, that took the lives of almost 50 people in an act of violence and incomprehensible hate. The town council and the mayor, still the mayor, same mayor, had decided to actually make an exception to their flag policy, and they flew the flag at half-mast out of honor for these victims. The mayor said this time he agreed with flying the flag to honor the memories of those who had died. And the councillor said they were actively working to change the town's damaged reputation, having remembered what happened years ago, and that the mayor's previous harmful comments do not represent the town or the council. And in raising the flag for shooting victims, the mayor said that anyone would feel compassion for the loss of life, which is hopefully true and nice to know. And that he felt that, and again, this is the mayor, and that he felt that the tragedy took the pride flag issue beyond his personal feelings, saying he'd have to be a pretty hard person to not have compassion for that incident, which is why he chose to let the flag fly. So while I don't think it should take a mass murder of queer people to make people want to be allies, it was nice to see this kind of public shift in perspective happen within Truro. And in flying the flag to honor those victims, the council made a public stand that they would not tolerate homophobia in Truro. And I think that was really important for the residents of Truro to see. So the very next month, though, and this is in 2016, so again, that 9 years after that first pride flag incident, the pride flag finally flew in Truro from the town hall, and it flew for the Truro's first pride parade, which was super successful. There was a large turnout. I remember going to that. I'd already graduated, moved away from Truro, but I came back for this, and it was so nice to see. I saw, instructors and professors and dean from Dalhousie marching this parade. I saw, tons of other classmates, all straight allies there, and just the townsfolk just turning out to watch, their kids all excited, just so happy to kind of finally show this kind of pride. So seeing all that cheering on was so great. It was really successful. And so then the organizers planned to make the parade an annual event. And then just this past summer, not only was there a Pride parade in Truro, but there was an entire week of activities for Pride, which I just thought was, really heartwarming. I attended some of these events. It was really nice to see how much the community has changed. So I just wanted to kind of talk about how we can see just the simple act of flying a flag can actually be a momentous act of allyship on a community level. So, Susan and Kyle were talking about how to be allies as individuals, but I think it's also important to think of what is a community allyship? How can the actual community show that as a town we can be allies? Because I think that shapes, instead of saying the silent majority of people that are supporting kind of homophobia, maybe that's not true. And maybe we can display that and show that and counteract that. So I think it's important for the community to see that queer lives are valued and loved, but not out of fear of hurting the town's reputation. I want people to show this kind of allyship out of the fear of hurting those queer members of the community. Sadly, flying a flag is still a very charged topic, especially in small towns. Just earlier this year, we heard about the case of a queer-owned shop in Lawrencetown, Nova Scotia, repeatedly having their flag torn down and vandalized. But the difference in this story was that the community support from the Allies drowned out the negativity, and it was clear that the culprits were the small minority of people. So that was nice to see. This isn't Truro, but again, just small town idea of Nova Scotia. However, the risks of flying a pride flag can extend beyond vandalism. As some of you might have heard, just this week, a shop owner was shot and killed for hanging a pride flag in her store in California. She was not queer identified herself. Lori Carlton was actually an ally who believed strongly in supporting her and showing her support for the queer community. And unfortunately, that allyship led to the loss of her life. So I don't want to tell the story to scare any of you away from wanting to be an ally. I actually share it to demonstrate the need of simple ally actions, such as flying a flag publicly still matters. So by flying a pride flag, you're actually telling the community around you that you are an ally and that you hope others are too. And it shows the members of your queer community that you're important. So this is a really, really tragic loss here. And I think that by more people showing that they care about the community and showing their pride, we'll see less acts of violence. It's when we start to be scared to show these things, we'll go back to that 2007 vibe. So I don't want people to be scared or put off from these ideas. So to end on a more positive note, I just wanted to share what actually happened when I did move to Truro. As you can probably guess, I did not go back to the closet. I instead decided to start a social club for 2S LGBTQI plus students on campus, as well as allies. And I called it Dial at Truro. The club started out small, with attendance mostly from my straight classmates who were just acting as allies to build up the numbers until the queer students found us and felt more comfortable coming. I managed to make some friendships from that group that I still hold close to this day. And the club even continued after I graduated in 2015, and it has been run every year by a new wave of queer students on campus, and is grown bigger and bigger with more activities, more events, and higher numbers, which is really empowering for me to see. So yeah, seeing the growth of queer acceptance in Truro, where active allies, the reputation, That's part of what made me feel confident about returning to Truro to teach. The first time I chose to come to Truro, I was like, oh, I need this program. It's only offered here. I have to go here. This time, this is me choosing to come back because I've been watching this growth. I've been watching the allies step up in Truro and say, no, Truro is a safe place to be. And as of last week, I've become the agricultural representative on the queering committee of the Queer Faculty Staff Caucus at Dalhousie. So I'm really excited to connect with other queer faculty and staff on the Truro campus and make an even bigger impact to the Dalhousie queer community in Truro. So I'm really, really excited about that. So I just wanted to say some parting thoughts about allyship so we can kind of move more into the discussion piece, but I thought this kind of led to that. So I want to say that allyship can be hard. We can see that. We've heard about different ways on how to do it, but just recognizing that allyship can be hard, especially if we don't know how to do things. It might be hard to do, or it might be hard to get right the first time, but I think it's still a very worthwhile pursuit. Being able to read those supportive comments in the paper likely would have lessened the blow. So it was important that people did speak up publicly against it. And what's more is that we saw the community gathered in protest against the decision. They actually rallied together. That strength and the strength in numbers really matters. And in small towns, the queer community is even more smaller. So they're even more dependent on allies to show up and be present at rallies. And then we saw how the county mayor was able to use his position of power to still fly the flag in Truro despite the council's decision, even though there was actually a risk to tarnishing his political career. So that's something we can think about, is what kind of roles of power do we have that we're in a position of power to maybe step up and show allyship. And we saw how the community of Truro all came together after the Orlando shooting to grieve the victims, show support for the victims' families. This act would have also shown just support for the queer residents in Truro, who were likely having a lot of emotional reaction to hearing about the news in Orlando. So seeing the support was likely comforting to them at that time too. We saw examples of how the community showed up to attend pride parades and events, support queer-owned businesses, and support student groups to show support as well. So I'm just hoping that the story that I've kind of shared will just act as more of a jumping off point for some engaging discussion, and we can just get into it now and hopefully we can go from there. So thanks for listening to that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Owen, for sharing your personal story. And it's, really pulls at the heartstrings, if I could just say that, to hear, the fear and trepidation of heading to a place where you anticipated you were not going to be welcome, and to see it end on I guess what I would think of as a more positive note, to say, in fact, the community was actually supportive all along, and this sort of myth that we often hear about that silent majority are not supportive is in fact not true, hopefully, in most of the cases. So it's really, thank you for sharing that. That's so important. Okay, so thank you to all the speakers. So what we'll do now, I'll stop the recording as promised, and we'll move into a discussion at this point. And let me just make sure I got the recording stopped. Just give me 1 sec. I'm a bit of a Teams stop recording. There we go. Okay, excellent.